Hello everyone and welcome to another CMF video on energy and decarbonisation. This edition is about the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, today supported by CBAMBOO. CBAMBOO is the carbon intelligence platform for heavy industry. Founded in 2023 by Gabriel Rozenberg and Daniel Sharp, the London-based company provides a specialised platform for the management of all CBAM'S. CBAMBOO enables importers to engage with their supply chain, collect emissions data, produce reports and run analytics. The platform translates complex, expanding CBAM regulations into user-friendly processes, helping companies navigate compliance requirements and optimise their carbon tax exposure. I'm joined by their co-founder and CEO, Gabriel Rozenberg. Hi Gabriel, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks very much, Simon. Great to be here.
Well, I'll kick straight in with my list of questions. Why should foundries care about CBAM?
CBAM is not just a run-of-the-mill regulation, not just something that you can implement and forget about. It's a completely new strand to all transactions of heavy goods across borders. And that strand is the carbon emissions information that needs to be managed alongside all of the traditional information around price, volume, quality. Why are we doing this? Well, because the EU has taken a step forward by creating its own CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the first in the world. And the UK is going to follow a year after that. So the EU CBAM starts in January 2026. The UK CBAM will start in January 2027. And these systems are explicitly models for how CBAMs are going to be implemented in many other countries. So we're at the beginning of something very large that's a very substantial change to people's business models. And what it's all about is making sure that the person who ultimately pays for industrial products also pays for the carbon emissions that were generated when those products were made. And if you're in the foundry business, you deal with a lot of heavy goods, and just the simple volume of carbon emissions that are in your supply chain is much, much higher than in almost any other industry. And so cast metals is one of those industries that is very substantially affected by CBAM. And so that's why it's so important.
We've been hearing a lot about the regulatory changes involved around CBAM. What's happening at the EU level and what are the future trends?
So the timeline of this is quite complex. The key date to keep your eye on is next January. That's the start of what the EU calls the definitive period of CBAM. What they mean is that's CBAM proper. Now, many of your members will have already been dealing with CBAM. So what have they been dealing with? They've been dealing with the so-called transitional period. It's really a preliminary phase of CBAM, a getting used to it phase. And it's been, the EU has been quite open about the fact that they've learned quite a lot as they've gone along in this preliminary phase. And they've made some adjustments and changes. I think it's fair to say that their communication about CBAM has not been perfect. And they've learned from that. And one of the things that they have realized is that they need to add some simplifications into the system, because the system as designed was pretty ivory tower and some of it was kind of unworkable. Now, there are still some things that we think could be improved, but a lot of the improvements that we've been pushing for, that a lot of industry has been pushing for, have come about in a new regulation that is currently going through the European Parliament and is expected to be passed in the next couple of weeks. That new regulation is kind of a tightening of the thresholds of CBAM, a simplification of some of the systems, and in modest ways, slight delays. So, for example, companies that import less than 50 tons of goods into the EU are no longer subject to CBAM. And to take another example, companies that import goods into the EU, they'll have to pay for what happens in January 2026, but the cash won't come out their account until 2027. So there are these adjustments, simplifications, which collectively make it easier. The problem is it's harder to keep track of things when things change, right? And, typical company does not spend its life like we do, reviewing the details of CBAM compliance regulations. So it's important for companies to take advice and to keep an eye on what's going on at the regulatory level. As I said, the key thing is CBAM will start in January and has not, at its core, been delayed either. And when it starts, a lot of the ways in which companies have been dealing with things in this preliminary time will not be okay. It will be necessary to get more accurate data. There'll be much more kind of legal liability around that. So that's one of the reasons we're having this conversation.
Absolutely, and thanks for joining me on that. Okay, so the upcoming steps, we've got this change coming in very soon, and then further on from that, there's sort of the verification process. How does that work?
So let's take a step back. You have companies in the EU that are importing goods from outside the EU, right? By the way, with trade within the EU, doesn't apply to CBAM. Does not apply. What actually applies there is the carbon pricing system that your listeners will be already familiar with. There is a carbon pricing, a cap and trade system of paying for carbon emissions that applies within the EU, and there also happens to be one that exists within the UK. We spun ours off after Brexit. Now, companies that are importing from outside the EU, the aim is to get them to pay for the carbon emissions in just the same way. So first of all, this year they need to get themselves authorized to import goods in a CBAM world. That's a one-time procedure. It's not tremendously complicated. We can advise, we are advising our clients on the steps that they need to take. Essentially a one-time form that needs to be filled in. Once they've got the authorization, then they're able to import CBAM goods such as iron, steel, cement. They're able to import CBAM goods into the EU. And by the way, if they don't get authorization, they simply won't be able to do it. So it is an important thing for all companies that have an EU-based importing system, which could include, of course, many British companies that happen to choose to have an EU subsidiary for easy importing. All of those companies need to get themselves authorized this year. Now, what's going to happen with verification, which you asked about, is the importer is being taxed on the emissions of what they have purchased. And they can't test the goods to see what the emissions are. The carbon dioxide's already gone out into the atmosphere when they buy it. So the only way to do that is to ask the supplier. And this is something that your members will be very familiar with because there's many, many British companies that have been asked for data about the process through which they created their goods. Or it can go in a chain. They might be, British company might be asked for the process. Well, maybe it bought the goods from Asia or upstream materials came from Asia. So they're finding that they also have to ask the Asian supplier for data. The key change in 2026 is that all of this has to be verified. Has to be verified by an independent third-party verification company. The verification does not have to happen from January of 2026, but at the end of 2026, companies will be asked, declarants in the EU will have to fill in a form of everything they imported in 2026 and will have to get emissions data for 2026. What is the typical carbon emissions content of my supplier? And that report will have to be verified data. And we're going to get more details on how exactly verification is going to work over the coming year. And we don't have the full precise detail of all of this at this point. So it's something to get ready for, but there's the best way to get ready for it is to do your best to get the data accurately now, and then be aware that you will be held to a higher standard of account when it comes to next year. There's one other step to mention about CBAM compliance, and this rolls the tape forwards a bit further. In the EU, the way that you're going to pay your CBAM bill is not by kind of filling in a form and sending a check off to the tax authorities. that system would be rather easier than what the EU's come up with. That easier system is what, in fact, the UK has come up with. But in the EU, they've come up with something a bit more complex, but also perhaps a bit more interesting, where an importer has to purchase what are called CBAM certificates. And these are instruments that don't have any tradable value of their own. Their value is set in line with the carbon price within the EU. And so you have a certain number of tons of imports, which translates to a certain number of tons of carbon dioxide. And for each ton of carbon dioxide, you have to buy a CBAM certificate priced at the level of 1 ton of EU carbon allowances. That's a pretty complex sentence there. But it will become a fairly standard system for any EU importer. At the moment, though, it's really early days. All we've got is some bureaucratic documents that describe the system. We haven't seen it working yet. It doesn't yet operate. So there's a lot of details to be ironed out. But it's something to be aware of. That's coming in the future. And again, we're already helping our clients plan their certificate purchases.
Okay, well, that's the European perspective. On the UK front, obviously, because our rules are potentially going to be different, the government's produced a draft set of legislation, a consultation document on UK CBAM. How does that approach differ from what is happening at the EU level? And what do you think UK foundries and importers should be aware of?
So the UK system is not yet finalised. So we've had draft legislation, as you said. We know that might change as it goes through the UK Parliament. I think the biggest unknown, and something that we might actually get some information about right now, when as we're speaking, Keir Starmer is in negotiations in Brussels to try to sort of change the terms of trade a little bit we have with the EU. The biggest unknown for us is, will we link our carbon price, right? Remember, we have a different carbon price. It trades differently. It's a different price. It's slightly cheaper than the EU's one. If we can link our carbon prices, then although we will put in place a UK CBAM for all imports, there will be a kind of cancelling out for UK EU trade. And that's tremendously important to UK importing businesses, because what do they import from? They import from the EU more than anywhere else. So if they can be treated effectively as though they were inside the EU from the point of view of carbon pricing and CBAM, that's a big bureaucratic simplification. The alternative situation, though, is kind of weird but similar, which is if we don't link our carbon prices together, but we have a structurally lower carbon price, then our CBAM might need to be recorded from EU to UK trade, but would actually result in £0 charge, because you only pay a CBAM on the difference, the positive difference between the two carbon pricing regimes. If the UK has €50 carbon price, but China has €10 carbon price, then you pay €40. I said euros, I should be pounds for the UK, 40 at the border, right? But if the EU is 70 and we're 50, we're not, there's nothing to pay at the border. So that's a little bit strange, but I expect that we will find a way to link our systems, and that will cut out a lot of the complexity of UK EU trade. The UK system is fundamentally very similar to the EU system. I mean, they have clearly taken the EU system and then said, how can we adapt this to fit in with existing UK systems? So essentially, it's being run by HMRC. And so they said, well, HMRC, this is very similar to VAT. This is an indirect tax. It's a tax effectively on goods. So it should work like VAT. We should have quarterly payments. And so Whereas in the EU, you'll have this system of annual payments with CBAM certificates. In the UK, after an initial 12-month period in 2027, which is the kind of getting used to it year, the plan is that in the UK you will pay CBAM quarterly, very much like you pay a VAT quarterly, and you have a quarterly VAT return. And also their plan is that the CBAM prices are not set on a weekly basis like they are in the EU, but on a quarterly basis. There has been a plan to change the scope of, to have a different scope of goods to the EU, but right now the current lineup of goods that are covered by CBAM is extremely similar to the lineup for the EU. So there are subtle differences, I'd say. Fundamentally, though, I think the similarities are much more important than the differences. Companies that exist in the heavy industrial space that manipulate and are ultimately financially responsible for high tonnages in any industry, but the cast metals industry is a great example. They will need to start thinking about the emissions tons that they are responsible for, because somewhere down the line, someone is going to actually pay a price for those. And that is a big change in thinking. I think it's ultimately a positive change in thinking that, you know, most of your members, I've talked to them before, do not oppose. But it is a system that will take time to get right. And I'm not surprised that people feel a little impatient with the bureaucrats, because this system hasn't really got going yet, and it is quite confusing at this point in time.
And just on that point, we're looking at dates in 2026 to 2027, and we're pretty much halfway through 25 at the moment. So there's not a lot of time to start to adapt.
There's not,
which is a concern for us. And I would urge anyone listening, if there are consultations on this topic, then please do respond. Make sure the government know your voice, and make sure you copy CMF in on those responses, because we can use that to amalgamate and build our own response. So please do get involved and give us your views. Okay, I'm going to move us on, Gabriel, because I'm conscious of time. So you've kind of covered on some of this already, but you talked about what should UK companies, or in this case foundries, be doing to prepare for CBAM compliance, and in terms of systems and processes, what should they be doing? I know there's a lot of members who are currently working off an Excel spreadsheet or a back of the old cigarette packet. What structure should they be put in place to ensure they're ready for CBAM?
So it depends on where you sit in the supply chain, but the likelihood is that many of your members, particularly the ones listening to this podcast, will be selling to Europe, or will be selling to someone who sells to Europe, and they'll have received a request for information, and that's where that Excel spreadsheet that you mentioned comes in. And it's not a good tool. It's extremely confusing. It is also completely undynamic. So what I mean is, if you are providing data in a spreadsheet format to your clients, what if you made a mistake? You know, you do then have to email them again. I'm terribly sorry. You know, they're your customers. You don't really want to bother them, so you tend to keep it, like, even if you discover a mistake, you tend not to correct it. But also, the way that CBAM works is that it's looking for the carbon emissions of every part of the value chain, and so it's sort of a nested boxes system. You are requested, if you can make sense of the spreadsheet, and I don't know many people who can, it requests you to put in the emissions of what are called precursor goods, the upstream goods in your supply chain that you purchase from. So you need to get data from them, right? And they may not, you know, they too could be using a spreadsheet, which that too could be inaccurate. So we've looked at this system when it came out, and you know, we've actually built something that we think is substantially better. And the good news is it's completely free to use. So our primary customer as CBAMBOO, as a software platform helping companies navigate CBAM, our primary customer is based in the EU or has an EU subsidiary that is importing goods. And that's our customer, right? They have the legal obligation to report. They have to get it right. And we work with that customer. As part of that service to clients, We get them to onboard their supply chain onto our platform. Supply chain companies are welcome to use that platform for free. Just go on our website, cbamboo.com, click sign up, and you can create an account. And you're guided through the process of putting your data together. Now, why is that better than a spreadsheet? First of all, it's much more visual. It's much easier to see what you're doing. You have to essentially, in CBAM, map out your factory production process and work out what the emissions are at each stage of that process, right? So we said, fine, well, we'll create a visual map of your site, as it were, a flow diagram, and say we buy from this, we do this, and we get these products, and this is the flow, and you can draw the flow diagram yourself. We call that carbon flow. And then if you want to link to your suppliers, you can onboard them as well. You message them through the app and you say, this is my supplier company. And if they send you data in spreadsheet form, it will take that in, that will work. Or if they also join the platform, then it can link live. So if they make a mistake, if they change it, your numbers will be updated. The advantage of that is that your numbers are always the most up to date. It's flexible. And if you have a client who's not on the CBAM'S platform, and obviously not all of the world's importers are yet on the platform, well, no problem at all. Yet, no problem at all. You can just download a spreadsheet that you can send to your client. So we've made available for free a spreadsheet generation service available at cbamboo.com. Log in, sign up, and if you have any questions to use that, just send me an email and I'll be happy to help people through it. To get into more detail of what companies should be doing right now, they need to be putting their data together. Software can help.
Absolutely. I think you've kind of answered several of my other questions in one there, Gabriel, which is around, if you were the CFO of a foundry, what steps would you be taking? How can CBAM'S help with this, frankly, headache? Because it's yet another layer of bureaucracy, albeit important, but it's falling on the heads of foundry management, and their primary goal is to churn out really good quality castings as frequently as possible. So this is outside their comfort zone, certainly from the people I've been speaking to. One of the issues that we touched on there was the pound, shillings and pence. And how can companies anticipate future carbon costs?
So once you've put your data together in this way, you will have output numbers that are initially unfamiliar but are not intellectually difficult to understand. It's the carbon tons, the carbon dioxide tons that are emitted for every ton of goods that you make or that you sell. We have to get used to the idea that you're paying for each of those tons, or that somebody is paying. The ultimate purchaser is going to pay. Now, you mentioned, what should CFOs be doing? I think it's important that business leaders see that this is not just a compliance exercise. There is compliance involved, but once you've got your head around the compliance, what's going to matter is how carbon intense is my production process, and could I reduce that? And we work with our clients to do exactly that, to look at this data that is produced through these kind of analysis and say, well, what if I was to purchase from a different supplier, right? What is the carbon intensity of different suppliers that I have? Now, if you are purchasing raw materials from 3 or 4 different foundries, you can be requesting their CBAM data. And indeed, there's nothing stopping you requesting CBAM data of a company that you don't buy from as well. And that's something that we think about, right? And you can compare and contrast, right? The lower carbon emissions per supplier will mean that your carbon emissions are lower, which means that your client has to pay less CBAM if they're importing if they're buying from you and importing from the EU. That kind of thinking is very new. And we believe that the CBAM systems that are being generated will actually put that kind of thinking into the CFO's workload on a permanent basis, right? So it's really early days, but I'd say anticipating future carbon costs, we can start to calculate that now. And the kind of analysis that we're doing for our clients is pretty valuable to them, because, by the way, if you are an EU importer, the amounts that you're paying are surprisingly large. Let's say you're an EU-based importer of metal goods and of cast metal goods, and maybe you import 20,000 tons a year of product. Now, economically, you might not be the biggest business in the world. You might not have enormous revenues, but from a carbon emissions perspective, you're bigger than Rolls-Royce. You're bigger than maybe even some very, very large engineering company. Why? Because you just handle a lot of heavy stuff, right? And what you wouldn't realize from, you cut through all the kind of sums and the rhetoric. Year one of CBAM, you're going to be paying 2 million euros on those imports. And that's a substantial amount of money to keep track of. And we can reduce that by 10% or 20% by getting companies away from using default values and getting actual data from the supply chain, and then thinking about how to optimize that. And that number in the year one, that's only going to rise because there is a kind of a ramp up of the economic burden of CBAM over the next decade. So
this is potentially going to be extremely a potentially large impact on businesses if they're not taking this seriously, recording their data accurately, and really working with experts to, I suppose, understand the figures they're putting in there. That could have a long-term negative effect on their, not only the profitability, but also if, as you mentioned, clients are looking at different businesses for the data that they're putting out there, then they'll be less competitive on that front as well. So it's got a real knock-on effect if they're not understanding what they're actually putting down. And just on a point, I know of a couple of foundries where people have said to me, "Oh, well, we're kind of putting anything down at the moment, just to fill in the boxes." Clearly, that's got a longer-term negative effect. So they need to start to take this seriously now.
Yeah, I think you're at risk of, look, it depends who you're talking about here, right? The EU importer, they got to think about, they're paying that cost. The supplier isn't paying that cost, but it's essentially part of their price that the client will see. You can think of it like that. Now, if you've just made up some numbers and the numbers are very flattering to your business, right? Then great, your client's going to say, "Oh, I'm buying from that company." And if you then turn around the next year and say, "Right, well, we've sharpened our pencils a bit. We had some people in to check our numbers, and our previous numbers were nonsense. And now you're paying 5 times as much for CBAM as you expected," right? I'm not sure how well that's going to go down. So I really think it is important for businesses to take this seriously and take good advice and use the tools that are out there to get an accurate picture of their emissions according to the CBAM system. It's not the simplest thing in the world, but I can tell you it is not as complicated as it looks, and there are people out there who are willing and ready to help you with that and smooth that path for you. And I think it just matters because these numbers, these carbon numbers, they're going to be something that affects every transaction that you do with the EU and ultimately with a lot of other countries as well.
Fantastic. Okay, Gabriel, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time in joining us today. What I would say to those on the podcast, join me and the CBAMBOO team at the forthcoming Net Zero Forum on the 12th of June in Wolverhampton. To find out more, do visit cbamboo.com to understand how they can support your business. And we hope to see you on the 12th of June. Thanks for your time.